Hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, or evening from whichever time zone you may be calling us in from today. My name is Rebecca Cronin, and I'm one of the Customer Success Managers here with the Altair Data Analytics team. Now, some of you might recognize my voice from either participating in some of our onboarding sessions or perhaps seeing my name within the online user community. The Customer Success team, we're here as another point of contact for you to reach out to at any time with any questions, concerns you may have regarding Altair solutions. And if you're unable to get a hold of your account manager, we're here to assist. Should you have any trouble accessing the user community or perhaps even your Altair One account, feel free to reach out. We do have a team mailbox that you can reach out to us, which is it's da-csm@altair.com, which kind of leads me to some housekeeping items. So in the side control panel, you should have a handout section that will include a copy of today's PowerPoint that we have, as well as a handout that my colleague Steve has created describing the sequential, aka serial and parallel jobs within Monarch Server. So please take advantage, download those for reference materials. You'll also see in the chat box, if you find this is a topic that you want some other colleagues, please feel free to send them that registration link to have them join us. Within there, you should also see the question panel where you may submit your question. And again, it does not have to be about today's topic. You can have anything related around Monarch that we will take time to address. Should we not get a chance to answer your question, we can submit a support ticket on your behalf so we can have some follow-up. And we'll try to do our best to get an answer within 2 to 5 business days. So I'd like to introduce our expert, Steve Caiels. Some of you may have had the pleasure of working with him. He's one of our senior professional service consultants. He has over 29 years of various technical support roles, including Altair, with over 20 plus. He started as a technical support engineer, promoted to our pre-sales consultant and training specialist for our EMEA, and his current role now as a senior professional service consultant. So again, if you haven't had a chance, he's a great resource to us. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn over controls to Steve. Let me make him the presenter, where we'll get started with our topic, reviewing the sequential and parallel jobs in Monarch Server.
Thanks, Rebecca.
You're welcome.
Okay. So yeah, I'd just like to start off with a quick PowerPoint, and then we'll come on to a live demo to actually see these things in action. So as Rebecca mentioned, we're going to talk about the various different ways that we can use parallel processing in Monarch, which it generally gives us better performance than running everything sequentially or serially. So I apologise for mixing up the terms here. We can blame that on the British dialect maybe, but serial, sequential, there's no difference between the two, and we're obviously comparing that to the parallel processing. So this is focusing on automators' ability to run more than one job and more than one process at a time. So by default, on a normal installation, Automator will run 10 parallel jobs by default. And it will make use of this parallel ability without us having to do anything extra. But it will only use them in certain situations. And if we want to make the most of it and increase our throughput and get maximum performance, then we can enable the parallel processing in other scenarios. So the default is to run 10 parallel jobs or processes side by side by default. That can be changed by whoever looks after your Automator installation. It's not configurable through the MS Admin website. If you're familiar with Automator, you'll know you log into it through a website, MS Admin website. You can't change it there. You need to change it in the configurator, which is one of the server components that gets installed during the first installation. It's not necessarily a good idea to increase that beyond the 10. It will, of course, depend heavily on your server and the resources that server has available. But increasing beyond the 10 can very quickly saturate the server. And once you get to the point where you've got too much saturation and contention, particularly for disk access, then it becomes counterproductive, and it can actually slow things down quite dramatically. So I wouldn't recommend changing the default value to 10, even if you do have access to the configurator, unless you're absolutely sure that the server has got plenty of bandwidth available. So if you don't make any changes and you don't specifically modify your processes to take into account the parallel processing, then Automator will still run jobs in parallel if those separate jobs are run at different times. So for example, if you have 7 jobs all scheduled to run at a set time, then all those 7 completely separate jobs, whether they're standard processes or visual processes, those 7 different processes will run in parallel. And they won't clash with each other. They'll use different temporary databases, and of course, as long as those jobs aren't trying to read or write to the same resources, to the same actual files, then they'll all be able to run in parallel, and there's nothing more you need to do. If you have 17 different jobs all scheduled to run at exactly the same time, 10 of them will run in parallel, and then the other 7 will get queued up. And as the first set of 10 slowly complete, those other 7 will follow in to take the available slots. There is a priority setting that you'll see in the process configuration, which will dictate which of the 17 get put into the queue first of all. Once the job is actually running, the priority doesn't make any difference. It's only the access to the queue that the priority changes. So there's nothing you need to do to make use of parallel processing if you're only thinking about running completely separate processes alongside each other. However, if you have a process and it's running on its own, or you only have 2 or 3 processes that you want to run at any given time, then you've potentially got parallel slots that are not being used, and you can make use of those by modifying the processes. So it's quite different between the standard processes and the visual processes. Standard processes have been around since the dawn of Automator. So I think maybe I'm not very good with dates, but maybe 15 years or more, maybe probably 20 years or more. Automator has been around, and it sort of started off with standard processes. A few years ago, we brought in visual processes, and these are much more configurable and much more flexible. And the same is true when we're talking about enabling parallel processing. But it is easier to see what's going on, particularly in terms of demonstration. It's easier to see the jobs and the way the jobs are running through a standard process. So when we come onto the live part, I'll do this primarily in the standard processes, and then just make a few sort of final demos in the visual process, and you'll see that the functionality is the same. It's just easier to see that functionality in a standard process. There's a little bit more work to do in a standard process if you want to make use of the parallel processing. So standard processes will potentially run in more than one job, and it depends on whether you have multiple projects or not. So again, if you're familiar with Automator, you'll know that a standard process is built on running projects. If you only have one project, then it will always run as a single job, or by default, it will run as a single job. If you have multiple projects, then by default, they will run as separate jobs. But again, the default action is for those to run sequentially. So there are no default settings that will allow a standard process to run in parallel. We have to go and make some changes, and we'll obviously see that in action. Visual processes are a little bit different. They always run in a single job, but within that job, you can configure and allow parallel processing. So to make use of standard processing, this really more is for reference rather than to read through line by line, so you've got it to take away. But there are 2 things you need to do to enable parallel processing in a standard process. And if you have multiple projects, you need to ensure that the default action of one project per job is ticked. If you've changed that to multiple projects per job, then it will run all of these projects as a single job, and you cannot parallel process within a single job in a standard process. So you must leave that on one parallel per job. And the second place we can make use of parallel processing is if you have a wildcard in your input and you have multiple input files. So those that are familiar with our music distribution reports that we use in a lot of training material, there's a January, February and March version of that music distribution report. If you open up all those 3 files together by using a wildcard, The default action is to run all of those in a single job. And again, you're not able to use parallel processing within that single job. But if you run each within its own job, then you can potentially run each one of those, in this case, 3 input files in its parallel job. And this is really where you start to get the performance benefit from it. So these 2 options allow a standard process to iterate into multiple jobs, and you can use both at the same time. So if, for example, here you can see we've got 4 projects. If we go back to our 3 input files, our January, February, March input files, we could actually burst this out into 12 separate jobs, and then our parallel setting would run 10 at the same time by default, and then the final 2 would run as soon as the slots became available. So these will multiply up together. So we need to be a little bit careful. You can, if you imagine if you've got 10 projects and you've got 1,000 input files, all of a sudden you've got potentially 10,000 jobs all being registered at the same time. So this is going to give the database, the application database, a lot of work to do. So we need to be mindful, particularly if we're using both of these options at the same time, but the principle is there. So that bursts out into separate jobs, but by default, these jobs are going to run sequentially or in serial. So the other important option that we need to do, and we can see in the screenshot here, this is, we've got 3 jobs running. We've got 3 jobs registered. The first job is running, and you can see the second 2 jobs are deferred while a parallel job is running. This text here, I guess, might be a little bit misleading. It's not actually running a parallel job. It's saying that if it was a parallel job, it would be running at the same time, but it's deferred because we don't have the option enabled here. So you need to go into the advanced options of the process. You need to allow parallel jobs. Here you can see you can also set the priority if you wish. Once you've allowed parallel jobs, you can then see that running the same thing, all 3 jobs are running side by side or in parallel. So this is a really important option, this allow parallel jobs in the advanced settings of the process. So why would we do that? Well, really, the only reason, certainly the only reason I can think of, is to get better performance. And there's a couple of examples here. These are real world examples, but they're on a virtual machine. So obviously your mileage may vary. And the only way to know what sort of advantage you're going to get is to run the jobs in a parallel fashion and in a serial fashion and see what works best for you. But on the virtual machine that I was testing it on, I had 15 relatively large files. I think about 140,000 lines of text, something like that. And those 15 different files, all the information was being extracted and it was being summarized into a fairly small summary, about a 35-line summary. This took 90 seconds to run in all the default settings. But you can see running it in parallel, the same process was completed in 25 seconds. So a reasonably good improvement in throughput there. And obviously, if you've got jobs that are running hours, then that becomes much more significant. However, it's not always the right way to do it. If those files are very small and they're only taking a couple of seconds to transform anyway, then the overhead of running it and separating out into the separate jobs can actually eat up all of the advantage. So the 15 small files that we're actually going to be using in the demo, because we don't want to keep on waiting 90 seconds for the job to run, obviously. So I'm going to be doing this with the small files. And you can see the 15 small files took 8 seconds to run in a single job and took 7 seconds to run in parallel jobs because of the overhead of creating those jobs all the time. So just bear that in mind as I'm going through on the live part. We don't really see the advantage when the processes are only taking a second or 2 to run for each file. The cons of running it in parallel are mainly that you can get contention on the output. So if you imagine if you've got 15 different files coming in, as we will have in this case, if we're trying to summarize those all into one summary, we can't do that if we're running parallel jobs, because we'll have the 15 different processes all trying to access the output file at the same time. And Automator needs the file available for exclusive rights when it's exporting the data to it. So it means we need to be a little bit more careful about, we have to do this in a 2-stage process, basically. We have to turn the 15 large files into 15 little summary files, and then have a second process that comes along and scoops up those 15 summary files and puts them back into one. Now, if you all want to create different files, then of course that makes it much easier. But if you are combining into one, it does make the building of the process potentially a little bit more difficult. Much easier in a visual process, as we'll come on to see. This is just a quick screenshot of how we build it in a visual process. There's also one additional advantage in a visual process. So in a standard process, we have a project, and those projects contain exports. So if we want to export, let's say, 2 different summary views and 3 different filtered table views, we'd have to do that as 5 different project exports typically. Those project exports will only ever run sequentially if they're in a single project. So we're not able to run the different exports of a project in parallel. Now, you could build a different project so that each project was only doing 1 export, and then you could run those different projects in parallel, but that's obviously a lot more work to set up. So I do urge you for many reasons, and this being one of them, if you haven't yet explored visual processes, I do urge you to take a look at them. They are much more flexible, and they make all these sort of slightly more complex processes that we might need to do much more available. So, this sort of process that we have in the screenshot down here is bursting the 15 different input files into 15 small summary files. And then the second process comes along and scoops all those together into 1 file for us. You would not be able to do this in a single process using standard processes. So let me move on to actually show you this in action. I'm just going to have a quick scan for questions. I don't see any at the moment. Okay, let me, yep, so I don't see any questions, so let me log in and actually show this in action. So I am going to do these on these small report files first of all, because obviously we don't want to wait a minute and a half every time we run the job. So it's a very straightforward Automator installation here. I've not got too much more going on in it. There's no jobs at the moment, just to keep things nice and clean. So what we're going to do is to take these 15 different input files. Now you can see, looking at the size, actually these files are likely to be identical. So just so we get rid of the any sort of differences in time based on the input file, these are identical, obviously, apart from the name. And what we're going to do is to take these files, even though it says small, they are in fact over 80,000 lines long, so they're not tiny. So what we're going to do is pass this through a model, and we're going to extract all the individual amounts and then create a summary based on the customer name and the media type. So the 80,000 line report has got, let's say 30,000 rows of data. I don't know exactly how much it is, to be honest, but let's guess 30,000 rows of data. They're going to be summarized down into the, I think, 30 odd rows of customer media and combination. And we're going to do that against all 15 files and then ultimately end up with a single export. So let's just have a look. Everything's default at the moment. So what the default means is that in my advanced settings, I do not have allow parallel jobs ticked. I'm running 1 project per job, which is the default setting, but all of this is based on a single project anyway, so this setting here is irrelevant for us. But if we go into the project itself, on the input here, again, it's using the default of all in a single job. So what ultimately we want to do is to do each in its own job, but this is the default to start with. And in the export, there's 2 different exports, as we can see. Because this is a standard process, I'm not able to export both of these in parallel. I can in a visual process, but not in a standard process. So this bit is stuck on sequentially in a standard process. So what this is going to do is it's going to export a summary first, a little bit unusual, but it doesn't matter. The export is going to create a single file called summary_all.csv. And if the file already exists, it's going to overwrite it. So it's going to treat them all those 15 input files as a single file. The table's doing the same thing, except it's creating a file called table.csv. So let's run this one first of all. And what we'll see in the jobs is we have a single job running. It only takes about 9 or 10 seconds to run. So it's still running at the moment. We can have a look at the output folder. 1651, so yeah, it has finished. So it's just created these 2 files. So if I refresh this screen, you can see job completed, and it's at 8 seconds. And what this has done, if we take a quick look at the summary, open this with Notepad, you can see all those 15 files, each one with 80-odd thousand rows, has been summarized down to these 33 rows. Roughly 1 million we're seeing here. Just keep this figure in mind, roughly 1 million for the Becky's Music Store on the CD. So this is using all the default settings. It's not using any parallel processing. To enable parallel processing, there's two things we need to do in a standard process. We need to modify the process. We need to, I think I just ran it again. Actually, it doesn't matter. It can run in the background. We need to modify the process. And because this is all about the inputs, we need to modify the project. And on the input here, we're going to say, rather than doing each in a single job, all 15 files in a single job, we want to do each one in its own job. Now, we need to be a little bit careful here. I'm going to leave this on the default just for one more example, because you'll remember on the export, what we're doing is for this one, we're exporting the summary. We're overwriting the summary, and we're using a static name. So I guess by preempting that, you can guess what it's going to do. I've not made any changes there, but let me save it just to be on the safe side. Let me make sure I've got my inputs. I did change that. Each in its own job. Yeah, okay, so I did save that. I'm going to keep the jobs nice and tidy. I did run it twice by accident, doesn't matter. Let me delete the jobs. So now what it's going to do, it's going to run the 15 jobs, but there are two problems at the moment. The first job, as you can see, it's not running them in parallel, and that's the whole point of this this session. And now, as I refresh that, you can see it's running through sequentially. It's just running down through the list. So we've actually, in a way, got the worst of both worlds now. We've told it that I want to create 15 different jobs, but it's running those 15 different jobs in sequence, and it's having to wait for the first one to complete before it goes on to the second one. And you can see now this is slower. The first job ran in 8 seconds. This job has now taken 17 seconds, and it's not even done the same work. It's actually not done a great job for us here because I've not configured it properly. So what we can see if we look at each individual job is it's opening up a single report file. So this one I happened to click on was number 9, and it's exported the 33 summary records and the 18,000 data records. But of course, it's set to overwrite it. So what I've actually done is I've done 15 consecutive jobs, each one overwriting the file. So if we look at the summary file now, you can see instead of having the million roughly, we've got 70,000. So this just contains the results of one file. And it doesn't make sense to append all these different outputs, because what that's going to do is we'll have the 33 summarized rows from the first report, followed by the 33 summarized rows from the second report. It's not going to re-summarize them each time we do the append. So doing it this way, because we're summarizing it, we've actually got to have a two-stage process. We've got to create separate files for each output, and then we've got to summarize those back together into a single file. Now, we can do that in a standard process, and we can get a good time saving by doing that. So there's two things that we need to do. In the process, I need to change the export by modifying the project so that each time it creates a different file. And the easiest way of doing that, I'll need to do this on both exports, is in the export name here, we can, instead of creating a static file name of all.csv, we can use the macro naming here, and I can automatically name my output alongside lots of different variables, but the one I use here is the name of the input file. So let me save that and make the same change on the table. So you may have noticed those macros there. There's lots of nice things like date timestamps, sequential counters, so that you never get the same file name twice. Values from the fields, data actually inside your report. But in this case, I'll just use the input file name in both cases. Let me commit those changes. And let me delete the output folder so we don't have those there still. Now if I run it, now you can see it's processing through, but it's still doing these sequentially. You can see they're sort of dropping in one by one. And I guess this might be delayed a little bit in the WebEx, but these are dropping in one by one. So we've avoided the first problem of overwriting the data, but we haven't got our good performance yet. So the final thing we need to do is to come into the advanced setting and allow these parallel jobs. And now we'll hopefully see a difference. Again, it's not going to be that dramatic because the files are so small, they drop in quickly anyway. But if I run this now, what we'll be seeing is we should see the first, well, in fact, they all drop in pretty much the same time, but the first group of 10 dropped in, and then the second group of the 5 that were left dropped in right after. But you can see that was a lot quicker, even just looking at the files arrive. And if we do the same thing looking at the jobs, let me tidy up here. If I come back here and just disable that parallel processing and run the job and just come back in here quickly to the jobs. So you can see this is still doing the parallel processing here, but at least we're now creating separate files, but we have to wait for every job to finish. And it's going to take the 17 seconds that we already saw. So remember, this is the job that took 90 seconds when we were doing it, or when I did this against the large file. If I come back in and turn on the parallel processing, and again, just delete the jobs to make it easier to see what's going on. Now we can see all these jobs are running, or the first 10 slots are running in parallel. Probably by the time I click again, okay, so there's one left that was still running there. But you can see it runs a lot quicker. So the longest job so they all get registered at the same time. So this is the genuine amount of time that the job took. So we've gone from the was it 18 seconds, 19 seconds, down to 7. So we're getting a good improvement in the performance here, even on these small files, and obviously that's an even greater performance on the large files. But that's left us with 15 different input files. So we would then need a second process to come along and mop up those different process files and turn them into one, basically. So this is going to create the final .csv and delete the original input files. So we do get back to having our 1 million here. So we get back to exactly the same results, but we've done it in 2 different stages. But those 2 stages together, we've gone from potentially 90 seconds down to 25. And then mopping up these files is very quick. You can see this last one's only taken 4 seconds. So that's the advantage, really. It's a performance advantage. If you're not using your parallel jobs by running lots of different sequences, then you can make use of that within a single process. I'm just going to check if there's any questions. I don't see any at the moment. No, okay. So let me just quickly recap that and show the same thing in the visual processes, because there are a couple of advantages to a visual process. So this is a standard visual process. Shouldn't have called it standard, I guess, that being the name of the other type of process. This is a default, if you like, visual process. And this is not going to make use of parallel processing. I've just put this distribution on here. It's not really doing anything. It's just creating a log event. It's just so that we can see how long the other process takes to run. So this is doing exactly the same thing as our standard process, but in a visual environment. I'm using the model here just so that we don't have different files to deal with, but the same would apply if you were using a data prep workspace. If I run this, or let me delete the output folder, just keep it tidy. If I run this, you can see it's doing the summary export. Again, it doesn't take very long, and it's finished now and it's done the distribution. So we're not using parallel processing here, and we can tell that by looking at the summary export. We can see there is just one event that's exported to 33 records. And that one event is taking all of the input files. If I show more here, you can see this is our 15 different input files here. So we're taking all 15 files, grouping them together in one, and then exporting just the summary. So I'm not doing the table here at the moment, but that brings us on to the first advantage. So in a standard process, you'll remember we had the table export as well, and it was running sequentially. So it was effectively doing this. We had to wait for the summary to finish before we do the table. What we can do with the visual process is just build it so that these run in series, in parallel, sorry. And depending on when we want this distribution to take place, if we want it to take place as soon as the table is finished, then we leave it like this. If we want this to wait until both are finished, then we join both together. And now this distribution, or the next stage of whatever we're trying to do, will only take place when both have run. So this is an advantage straight away in a visual process, regardless of if you're going to use the hub and that we're going to take a look at and all those sorts of things. You can define it very easily and do these exports in parallel. Just to keep it a little bit more straightforward, I'll get rid of the table export, come back to where we were. So if we want to use parallel processing in a visual process, we need to make use of this hub. And the hub needs to drop in, depending on what you're trying to do with it, but in this case, the hub needs to drop in before we start doing the export. And the default action of the hub is to group everything together and export it all in one. So if I were to run this now, it's going to do exactly the same as it did the first time we ran it. But you see we have two options here to group files together. We can do individual on export only, and if I select that and OK it, you'll see what this has done now is it's changed the icon here to this sort of stacked icon. And what this allows us to do is to create a separate file for each input. So previously we created one file. Oh, I forgot to change the name here. So it's created a file called small.csv. But if we edit that, we'll see that is the million there. It's a CSV file instead of a fixed width file, but that's got the million for it. So even though it's called small one, it is against all the files because I forgot to change the name of the export. So having the hub here and having this on individual export only allows us to burst this summary out into separate files. So of course now, rather than creating a static file, I would need to, where are we? Here, I would need to edit the output file. Oh, and I'm actually already using the input name, so I don't need to change this. So because it's not grouped together, or maybe I should say because it was grouped together initially, it just used the first file alphabetically as the output name. So that's why it was called file 1. So now it's going to create 15 different files because of that hub option. But you see it's still only doing one distribution. This is not using parallel processing yet. If I run this, we can see it's a little bit slower, the same as it was in the standard process, because it's now having to do the job sequentially, and it's not taking advantage of the parallel processing. So what we see here in the summary export is we still only have 2 events. We've got when it started and when it completed as the events, but you can see that summary export is made up of 15 different sequential exports. So we're not really getting the advantage here at the moment. We're doing a single job in effect, and that single job is doing 15 different exports. But the advantage is it's only doing one distribution. So if this was an email or a move or do something else, then it's only doing it once, which is probably what we want to do. To make use of parallel processing, I've got to come into the hub, and rather than doing individual on export only, I've got to use the full individually option. Now to start with, if I don't change anything else, you can see this is making things maybe even worse. It's still not going to use parallel processing, but now it's going to do 15 different distributions. That's not what we want in this case. What we want in this case is I do want to process these in parallel. That's the whole point of getting the performance out of the export. But I don't want to do 15 different distributions. So I need to drop another hub in here. And that second hub is going to be left on group everything together. So it sort of puts it back into serial processing, if you like. And this is the fastest way to do this in terms of processing power. So obviously a little bit more work involved in building the process, but the benefit is, again, not much benefit on these tiny files, but potentially the benefit is this is the fastest way of doing it. And we can see the difference here in the log. Rather than having 2 events in the summary, we've now got 30 events. So it's doing 30 true parallel summary exports. And you can see the way they're stacked up here in time is you've got these sort of 10 added to the queue first, and then they start to complete, and obviously there's little bits of differences in terms of file IO and that sort of thing. So as soon as the job completes, then the next one gets added in. So we'll find 15 starts in here, and obviously they're front loaded, so everything gets started as soon as it can, and then it's just left finishing. So the end result is exactly the same, but this is the fastest way of doing it. Still only 2 distributions. The big advantage of you doing it as a visual process is actually the point of having this distribution here. Maybe we don't want to do a distribution, what we can do here is do the second part of the job. So you remember in the standard process, we have to have one process to burst everything out, and then a second process to collect it all back in together again. In a standard process, it's actually quite difficult to chain those two together, because you can run another process after a process is completed. But if we've burst that process out into 15 different jobs, it's not really easy to say, okay, that's the 15th one completed, and now I want to come along and mop up my results. So it's actually quite difficult to daisy chain those processes together in a standard process, but it's very easy in a visual process. And it's just done in a very similar way to the way we had it before. So you can see what we had previously was the hub just going on to distribution. What we have now is the hub going on to the second part of the process. So again, if I just delete all these to get things nice and neat and tidy, and then I run it, you can see now it's running the export, it's running the summary export. And I think actually this is running against the large file, so we will have to wait 25 seconds or so here for it to do the large files. I won't run it in a serial process and wait the 90 seconds, but it is doing the large files now, so we can see it running. You can see these are all the files being created. It's created 15 large summaries. It's just about finished. It's doing the second group of 5 now. You can see they all dropped in fairly quickly. So I should have opened this up first a little bit quicker. Maybe we'd have seen the 10 drop in more or less together, and then a pause, and then the second set of 5 drop in more or less together. But hopefully you just about saw that. And then the second part of the process, as I've been talking, has now run, and it's combined all these 15 back into our final.csv. It's not deleted them in this case, but obviously that could be done as part of the process. And in fact, it looks like I've set this to append incorrectly and run them twice. So apologies for having double the quantity there, but that's just a little mistake in the demo I've made there. But hopefully it shows the principle of how we can combine those two together and get the results that we're looking for. So the most important things here are that we've got the first hub set to do everything individually and allow the parallel processing. We then need to make sure we have a second hub that sets it back to do things sequentially, and then anything from that point onwards will only run once. So that's a sort of real lightning overview of the parallel versus sequential processing. So the only advantage really of using sequential processing is to get better performance, but of course, one of the beauties of Automator is that it's a very fast engine, particularly if you're taking data from text or PDF files and turning it into Excel, CSV, fixed width text. We can deal with huge volumes of data. And if we've got a lot of customers where Automator is running for 18 hours a day, if you utilize parallel processing, you might get that down to 4 hours a day or 6 hours a day. And maybe then you only need one Automator server instead of needing 2 Automator servers, for example. So that's the reason for it. Any questions? I don't see any questions in the control panel. There is a question just come in. So several years ago, building some processes that needed to be daisy chained together, told that hubs were the biggest time eater in the process. So hubs have improved a lot. And I think one of the things you'll notice, that one of these differences is the individual export only. In the early days, we could either do grouping or we could do individually. So the problem I had, basically it was everything beyond that hub would run multiple times. They've improved a lot. I mean, the only way of achieving this is to do it using hubs. So it's a little bit difficult to compare. Would it be quicker to do this as 2 different processes? And so the other option you've got is, rather than having this second hub in here, and I'd have to test this to see which one was quicker, but in theory, the other thing you could do is you could create a completely separate process, and you could then daisy chain the second visual process. So we could avoid the need. No, we still need to use the hub actually. So I don't think it would help it here, because if we don't have the hub, it's going to call the second visual process multiple times as well. So I think there is an overhead to using a hub for sure, but if you're using the parallel processing, the advantage you get through the parallel processing, unless the files are tiny, the advantage you get through using the parallel processing is going to far outweigh the disadvantage of using the hub. If you don't use the parallel processing, then yes, you'll notice that the using it with a hub is slower than using it without a hub. So it just depends on whether you need the functionality, I guess. It's better, but it's not cost-free still. Okay, so I'll just keep an eye on the questions as if anything else comes in. I don't see any new questions in there, so we have a couple of pre-registered questions. So I'll go on to those. The first one was about, so the question is, I have an export that generates different Excel files for each first key. How can I add additional sheets to each of these files? The other exports have different columns. Is there a way to do this? If I've understood the question correctly, yes, there is, and I think I can show that here. Let me just break these apart again just to simplify this. So we don't need the hub here. So I'm going to preach what I practice and take the hub out because there's an overhead that we don't need. So I'll just delete the hub and I'll put it back into a standard summary export, and we don't actually need any of these for this question. So in a summary export, so the first part of the question is saying that there's a summary export that's already creating separate files. So I imagine that's done by using this option here. Each distinct value of the first key makes a separate file or table, and it's an Excel file. So by changing a file that supports sort of a concept of file and table, such as Access or Excel, we have an option now of either naming auto files or auto tables. So I'm guessing what's happening at the moment is it's each distinct value creates a separate key. So if you imagine from our input files, the summary is based on the first key of the summary is the customer name. I think this will probably work without me having to do any work to it. But I will take it back to use these small input files, so we're not waiting quite so long for the results. So we're going to take all 15 small files, create a summary, and then burst this summary out to create a separate file per key field. So let's make sure that's working to start with. So I didn't save those changes. We'll do each distinct makes a separate Excel file. We can do XLSX. Destination file. Summary. I think that's going to be auto name by first key field. So in fact, I don't need the input file name. Why did that go back to delimited text? Sorry. XLSX, first key value dot text. So I think that's going to be okay. And then we'll just call this one first export. So what we should see now is this is creating, if I've configured that correctly, just going through it quickly. No, I haven't. I thought I made a mistake. Okay, so it's okay. I've just got an extra file name in there. So I didn't edit the file name correctly. It's created a folder called .xlsx. But inside here, I don't have Excel on this machine, so I'm just going to need to quickly drag this across if I can. Let me drag it for the moment. Let me see if I can paste it here. No, it won't let me paste it at the moment. Bear with me a second, sorry. Okay, so I'm just opening it up on my local machine so I can drag it back in. And so you can see it's automatically created a separate file based on the first key. So it doesn't really make sense to have that first key displayed. You could hide that if you wanted to, but you can see we've got an Excel file called first export. And it's automatically created the file. So what I'm hoping the second part of the question is, how do I now add second tables to these files that have just been created? And we can do that by creating a second export. I've only got one summary in this particular model file, so I'm going to need to export the same summary data again. In fact, no, we can, yes, we'll need to do the same summary again. But if this summary, if you had multiple summaries in the model file, you could do this with multiple summaries. It needs to be daisy chained, because the important thing here is the first one's going to have to create the files. The second one's going to have to add data to those files that have already been created. So the important steps here are, on the first export, we need to make sure we overwrite the file, so that if the file does happen to exist with old data in it, it's being overwritten and it's going to be updated with the new data. On this one, we need to make sure we configure it. So I'm just going to choose the same output file. With the same .xlsx mistake in there, just so I don't have to change the old one. So the important thing here is we need to change this first tag. So I'm going to burst these out again. This time I'm going to add data to the file. This is the most important bit. So when this second export happens, it'll see the file already exists. It'll now allow us to add the data. So we can call this second export. And that should be pretty much all we need to do. So let me just run this again. So we'll see the 1715 tag on. These will get updated to 1718 as the new process runs. So I'm just waiting for it to finish here so I don't grab anything halfway through. Okay, so one of them has failed because I probably have the file open still, I guess. Which one's failed? So let me just see if that has worked without having to spend too much time. I think I've just got the file open still, but let me just copy this and paste it onto my desktop here. Okay, no, I have made a mistake somewhere. So I think probably what I've done is not specified the file path correctly. Okay, so it hasn't actually. I think it might be because I've got the .xls in there. Let me just see if that works. Nope. Each file option, file naming. Okay, maybe I didn't do that. First key value, add data, none. Untitled is okay. First key value. Yeah, I think I forgot to change that auto name there. So it was basically trying to create a file with no name. I think. Okay, hopefully it's worked this time. Yeah, there we go. So now what this has done, apologies that it took a bit longer than it should have. I'm just going to paste this onto my desktop again. And hopefully now we should see, it still hasn't done it. Okay, I'm sorry about that. I probably need to spend a little bit more time stepping back and doing that in a bit more detail. But this is the theory that should have done that. I'm not too sure why that's being overwritten. We've got the first one overwriting it and creating it. We've got the second one adding data, first key value. Okay, so it's created them in two different folders. Output file. So sorry about that. What I'll do is I'll take some screenshots of this and we can include it in the first part of the next session. But basically, I'm messing up the paths there. I think because I had that .xlsx in there as a rogue part of the first path, it's caused a bit of confusion. But as long as you point both of these to export to the same file, and you make sure this one is set to add data, then you should be able to create additional tabs in the same name.
Steve, there was an addition to the question regarding the multiple files that he was using Monarch Classic.
Okay.
So this
yeah, same principles apply. Yeah, same principles apply. So if it's Monarch Classic, when you go through, so if it's the desktop product with Monarch Classic, you have the same options basically. When you I don't have a project here, so I won't have those options available to show. But when you go through the export definition, you'll have exactly the same options to append, overwrite, add data, all those sorts of things. If you're talking about Monarch Classic within a standard process, then again, the same would apply as you go through. I think I probably should be able to do that here, actually. If we come back to the standard process, edit a project, export, summary. Overwrite. Yeah, so same thing here. So this is similar to how it's going to look in the desktop product. So here you'd have to make sure this first option is add data to the file, and then when you go through to specify the tab name, burst by customer files. So here, okay. So yeah, there's an extra step here actually. Sorry. So on the previous screen, you'll need to have the burst outs. And then you can have the automatic naming. This is still going to be by files. And then here, yeah, it's the same thing basically. You take out the macro naming to make sure it's. I think this is what's caused the confusion because I was modifying a process that already had the macro naming. I think that's where the mistake came in. So be a bit more straightforward if you're not already using the macro naming. But you just need to make sure that this is set to add data to the file, and you should be able to do the same thing. Any more questions there? Okay.
So actually, let me try to take control real quick, or I just want to share the poll question before we lose our audience.
Mm-hmm.
So I know there was one more. So let me launch that question. So if you happen to be in expanded view of the session, you'll have to minimize to answer and make your vote. So for our November 13th session, would you like to learn more about DPS summary enhancements within Monarch Data Prep Studio, updated XML and JSON parsing capabilities within DPS, or perhaps review some tips and tricks when you're working with some formula functions within Monarch? And if none of these are topics of your choice, in our closing survey, when the session ends, there will be a question where you can add additional comments. So you can submit a different topic idea that we can incorporate for the next voting. So you'll see that you'll have the option to select one thing that's really important that you'd like to cover. I know it doesn't give you multiple choice, but help us narrow down which topic is of interest that you'd like to kind of review. And again, you know that here we can answer, if you go to the session, any question you can ask, even if it's not about the topic. So you might have an opportunity to cover that. So I see we're about 75% of the way there. So for those who haven't voted, get your vote in. And we'll do a countdown. So we'll start with 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. And the popular vote is to look over some tips and tricks with formula functions in Monarch. So that will be our topic for next. session. And let me get my slide. Again, I know there was one pre-registered question to the colleague that submitted it. We will try to get back to you. We need to do some investigations. And again, we'll try to see if we can get that answered to share in the next session, or we'll try to reach out directly. Let me make myself presenter real quick just to show some closing slides. So again, if you did not have the chance, on that handout section in that slide control panel, there was a copy of Steve's PowerPoint as well as this PowerPoint. In here, you can see some of the different resources that are available for you for further enablement. Let me go. And then how to get a hold of support. If you haven't joined the community, please do so. This is how you can contact our support team right within that homepage. The Monarch Forum, if you subscribe, you'll receive email notifications when a colleague submits a particular blog post or event, plus it has the links to some helpful resources. Our documentation is always a great resource there. We have a model library app, so there are some pre-built models and workspaces that you can leverage if you search within that link. Our Altair Learning to get access into your own self-paced for these different courses. I know they're working to create an advanced certification test for those who haven't done it yet. There is a Monarch Complete that you can earn a LinkedIn badge. Marketplace is where you'll find the latest Monarch application or our other tools. If your organization hasn't had the leverage the opportunity to scheduling and complimentary onboarding, we do provide that. Upcoming events, wanted to share, we have this How to Thrive in a Transforming Digital World. It's coming up October 23rd. You can kind of see what the team is advertising for the future of AI. As mentioned, our next session is November 19th. Correction, I said the 13th, I meant the 19th. So you get the opportunity to learn about that tips and tricks with some formula functions. And like this puts us right at the dot. Oh, just a little brag here. We are recognized in Gartner's Magic Quadrant for our data science application. And again, so thank you all for joining. Sorry we ran out of time. Hopefully this is helpful. We'll try to get this recording up into the user community site so you can have back as a reference to replay. So thank you all. Steve, thank you. Have a great day, everybody.
Appreciate your time. Thank you all.